right, but we'll see. Should be pretty obvious if I do that.
Okay, we should be set up on the YouTubes.
Great.
Ready to go. Yeah.
All right, I guess we'll get started. So, hello, everyone. Good to see some familiar faces from the last Z Festival, and hello to new people and anyone watching this after the fact. And thank you, as always, to Peter and Shoshana for putting this on and doing such a great job. It's awesome to be part of such a cool, virtual, yet tangible, real thing. So thank you. So today I thought, after getting some feedback about what people were most interested in, I'd try to do like 15 to 20 minutes on 3 different topics that seemed most of interest. And then obviously, if people want to get in touch for anything else, you're more than welcome anytime. Happy to help if I can, nerd out about stuff. But today I was thinking of covering this idea of unorthodox, non-traditional kind of recording and sound design, and how to approach that maybe. And mixing and mastering, there's a lot of interest, and Max MSP and Super Collider. So yeah, definitely not going to go too deep into anything for reasons of time, but I wanted to mention, if anyone gets a taste of something from this and wants to meet later, either one-on-one or like in a small group, if you have a couple other people from the Z-Fest crew that are, interested in a certain thing, I'm happy to find a time for that, because honestly, that's probably the best way to go deeper into some of this stuff. But I'll try to do what I can today. So I guess before I talk about the recording thing, does anyone have any questions or, like pressing concerns about anything, just to get out of the way about any of that stuff before I launch in? No pressure. Okay. So unorthodox recording. It's one of those things, I mean, a lot of recording is unorthodox recording, obviously, and especially in a more of like a sound design world, there might be reasons why you would do things to get a certain kind of effect that would fly in the face of conventional wisdom, and tons of pop music has been recorded in really inventive ways. So it's nothing too revolutionary, I guess, that I'm talking about, but it's more kind of a mindset where you're not thinking so much in terms of the sound as something to capture, but as something to kind of manipulate or sculpt. And so like I mostly do classical recording and a little bit of jazz recording, and my sort of philosophy in that world is almost like a photographer. You sort of set everything up with your microphones almost as if they were cameras, and then you sort of take the picture of the music in a as neutral a way as possible. That's typically what I do, but you could just as easily approach it kind of from the total opposite direction and think, forget about what this sounds like coming out of the instrument or coming out of the modular synth or whatever it is. It's just like my raw material, and I'm going to make it whatever I want. So that's a really interesting way of working, and there's a lot of cool things you can do. And I'll just mention a bunch off the top of my head, things I've tried, things that might be like anecdotally interesting, and then we can do a little Q&A, I guess, if that resonates with anyone. So one thing that's really cool to try is, especially if you're in a small space or a place that doesn't have great acoustics, is to use what's called a boundary microphone, or sort of the boundary microphone principle. And the reason for that is that if you're in a small space and the sound is bouncing all around, any microphone in that space, whether it's a fancy one or a cheap one, it's going to pick up tons of the reverberation of the room. And even if it's not reverberation in the sense of like an echo, it's going to give this sort of imprint of like, I'm in a small room, and it kind of colors the recording in a way that you might not want. So a really good way to circumvent some of that is to put a microphone on a boundary, like on the floor, for example. So there are fancy ones like this is like an official, boundary mic where you can see like that's the membrane, and you put this on the floor. But you could do that with any microphone. You could just put it on the floor instead of on a stand, which seems a little crazy, but it can actually really work. And especially if you're recording something that has a lot like that is sounding kind of weird in the room, just trying that can often help a lot. And similarly, if you're in a room where you're if you have like a hallway or a large volume of space, it can be interesting to play with that as part of the sound. So instead of resigning yourself to like, whenever I record this thing, I'm getting a bunch of the sound of the room, and it's like, I just want this clear sound. Like maybe you do want that clear sound, and then unfortunately, honestly, there's not a lot you can do. But if you're willing to be sort of tenacious about it, you could also say, you know what, there's no way I'm going to get around this. I'm just going to embrace it and like go twice as hard in that direction and get an interesting sound, even if it has a ton of the room. It can be really cool. And a classic example of that in pop would be like something like you know Led Zeppelin, when the levee breaks, they famously put the drum mics like way up in a stairwell, and then they got this like incredibly huge boomy kind of sound, which is totally not what people normally do, but it sounds awesome. So if you have a space where you're struggling to get it to sort of sound right, maybe try putting the mics even somewhat further away, or just try to orient yourself and the microphones and the sort of architecture of the space you're in to make the space even more prevalent, if that sort of works for the aesthetic of what you're doing. And then going hand in hand with that kind of approach, you often do need to do a little more TLC on the processing side. So like in that kind of neutral classical approach, ideally you spend a long time fine tuning everything, and then you kind of record, and then you pretty much just make some balance adjustments and a little bit of this and that, and it's done. If you're doing this kind of like unorthodox approach, you should be prepared that like it might sound a little weird straight out of the microphone, but that's where things like compression and EQ and panning and all kinds of stuff can really help to make it come alive and be like a really interesting sound. So don't be necessarily like demoralized if you try something and what you immediately get sounds kind of weird, because again, that can just be kind of like the raw material for turning it into something else. And another thing kind of on that note that can be cool is what in pop music they often will call like reamping. So if you have a track and you want to make it sound sort of bigger or different, you might take something that's already been recorded, play it back through a speaker in a different room, like a big echoey room, and record that. So that's obviously done for a lot of more conventional stuff, but regardless of what material you're working with, that could be a cool thing to explore. So maybe you make a recording that's super dry. It's like really up close on your instrument because you're in a small room. You're not super happy with how it sounds. So you're like, you know what? I'm going to go super close, try to minimize the room and just get like a clean recording. But then, as we all know, hearing those kind of recordings, especially if you're a vocalist or a string player or something, it can sound like really kind of harsh and like there's just no kind of halo of space around it. So a great thing to try, of course you could do some artificial reverb and plugins and all that kind of stuff, but another totally valid thing would be, take that recording, get a decent, full range speaker to play it back with, and go like record it somewhere. You can record it in a garage or in a, like a forest or whatever, and just see what happens. Like that kind of thing can be really cool. To give something a little more life. And then of course you can blend it, once you have the new one, you still have the old one, you can, proportionally mix them, that kind of stuff. What are some other things? Contact mics, I'm sure a lot of you have experimented with them. They're super useful for stuff, really interesting to get kind of unorthodox sounds with. Definitely recommend playing around with contact mics. I would recommend also for people who want to try something kind of different. Um, there's also a lot of stuff you can do with like sort of acoustically creating effects that you might normally do digitally. So again, it's like one of those things, there's so many plugins, there's so many ways you can create an effect easily, but if you want something that sounds really organic, sometimes it's better to do it acoustically. So like a really easy thing I did at one point when I was doing a lot of music that was kind of like algorithmic music with samples that were being manipulated, and I wasn't happy with the samples were just too digital for me, and I wanted something a little bit like crunchier. So I re-recorded all of them onto a Walkman, and it was like a really shitty Walkman, and the input was like consumer line level, of course, and the output of whatever I was feeding it was um, professional line level. I didn't have a pad, and so I did my best, but like it was kind of crunchy and distorting a little bit, and there'd be these like weird tape artifacts, like this kind of compression, because I was hitting it so hard. There'd be like whenever there was a sharp attack, there'd be these weird kind of decays that were, and at first I was like, oh, this doesn't sound anything like the samples. And I was like, you know what, no, this is awesome. So I recorded all of them onto this terrible Walkman, and then put those back in through my interface, redigitized those. So then I had two versions of all my samples, like a really clean digital one and a really weird, crunchy, messed up tape one. And it was really, really cool to experiment with that. And again, like a lot of it is in the post-production too. So something I found was like with the clean ones, if you did something like put some reverb on a clean one, it sounds like, we all know sort of what that sounds like. But if I did more of the processing to the tape ones, it actually sounded much more. It really created like a sort of analog digital electroacoustic, like what am I even listening to kind of sound world that I really enjoyed at the time. So yeah, that's an easy thing to do. You could do something similar with your phone too, and this is also where a lot of devices that may not be like the highest fidelity can actually be an asset to making weird, interesting sounds, and kind of embracing imperfections and stuff like that. So that's a lot. Maybe I'll stop for 1 second. If anyone has any questions or thoughts on that, I could definitely go on a bit more, but.
You cut out earlier. You said there's some artist that recorded at the top of a stairwell. Can you say that name of that artist?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Led Zeppelin. It was the I forget who the engineer was on that particular record, but it may have, I don't know if it was Glyn Johns, who famously recorded a lot of the other Zeppelin stuff, but they basically took two ribbon mics, Beyer M160s, and put them way, way, way up high, like 2 or 3, stories high above where the drums were in this really resonant space. I've never heard, I mean, I don't know if anyone can hear the clean original tracks of like what came just straight out of the mics into the tape machine. But like when you hear the drum tracks in isolation, which you hear at the beginning of the song of When the Levee Breaks, that opens with the drums, there's a lot going on there that's not just from the mics. There's like some serious vintage, tube compressors and other stuff going on. So it's definitely like this balance of, maybe you start out with something kind of weird that entails a little bit extra TLC in the post-production stage, but you could end up with something really, I mean, that's like a legendary sound for sure. I would love to hear, do you guys know that some of the stuff that like Paulino Oliveros did in Caves, like it would be so badass if someone did a sort of like Led Zeppelin treatment to some of those kind of recordings, like I think if I remember correctly, those are recorded kind of au naturel, but yeah, heard a really good album that was made in Find Your Own Reverb Chamber, Laura. Yeah, exactly. I heard someone recorded something in a railway tunnel that was really cool. It's really beautiful. Yeah, different spaces. I would say like I would say probably the three sort of recommendations I would have are like, don't worry about the sound too much in the moment because you can change it later. Like, treat the sound as raw material. Embrace imperfections of equipment, and think of the spaces that you're in as like part of the, as a, you know, a parameter, I guess, for how to affect the sound. Yeah, stairwells are great. Parking garages. And there's also you know, another thing I wanted to mention, convolution reverbs are really cool. And there's lots of free plugins for that, to do convolution. And people forget, you know, convolution reverb isn't really, I mean, convolution doesn't mean reverb. You know, convolution reverb is a kind of reverb, but the process of convolution digitally can be done with anything. So you could feed in a recording or a live performance or whatever it is and convolve it with, you know, an impulse that you made in anywhere. It doesn't have to be perceived as reverb per se. It can just be used as a, you know, shaping tool. And you can even load in, instead of like a relatively short impulse, you can load in, you know, an entire song and convolve something with the song. And then, you know, it's a little weird, but then you're ending up with like certain, basically statistically, you know, certain average tonal and like energetic material from that song will then be the most mapped onto your input. It gets a little bit bizarre and unpredictable, but yeah, yet another thing to mess with. Yeah, so Taves, I'm far from being a mathematician, but from what I understand, it is convolution in a mathematical sense, but it's being performed on two streams of samples. So like, I don't know enough about how convolution exists outside of digital audio to know, like, maybe that's a kind of very specialized implementation of the process of convolution. Like, I don't know what mathematicians convolve typically, but yeah, that is what it is. And yeah, there's the convolution plugins out there you can mess with. It's a really fun thing. Cool. Well, I guess that's a pretty good segue into some other stuff, unless any other last minute things on unorthodox recording. I hope three things wasn't too ambitious to cover tonight. Needless to say, if anyone wants to talk more, please let me know. I just felt bad because I offered so many, and then like everyone was like, oh, this and this and this and this, and I was like, that's irresponsible of me. Now I don't know how I can narrow it down. Okay, so I guess we could talk a little bit about Max and Super Collider. That would sort of feed in pretty organically, I suppose. So I have my other computer here, and I'm gonna try to wear headphones, sort of, and share my screen, and we'll see what happens. All right. So first of all, I wanted to mention just a little shout out to Pure Data, because anyone who's interested in Macs and maybe doesn't want to spend a bunch of money on Macs, Pure Data, as you can see, is, as you will be able to see in a second, it's a lot less pretty. It's very sort of Spartan, but this can do almost everything that Macs can do. So that is a really useful thing to check out if you're interested in just playing around, especially with the basics. And I learned using Pure Data before I got into Macs, and almost all of the basic principles are the same. PD does not really have jitter per se. There's some visual stuff, but it's not nearly as fancy. But like under the hood, the basic, filters and the signal flow stuff is all the same. There's actually a handful of things you can do more easily than in Max. The main thing is it's just not nearly as pretty and it's not as user-friendly. But for basic stuff, it's fine for learning how this type of environment works. And it's obviously, as you can see, it's that same paradigm of like little sort of Lego blocks that are connected with these virtual cables. So I just wanted to mention that. Also in Max, I have a bunch of stuff that I realized I couldn't open anymore. A bunch of what I have for Max and for Super Collider is from quite a while ago. So I'm gonna show what I can. A lot of stuff that I have is like older versions and I couldn't get it already in time. So I'll show you what I can. And happy to make time to talk with people more later about either in more detail. But Max, I wanted to show this little video. This is a sort of virtual instrument that I made a while ago, and quite a while ago, and it's coded in Max, and basically it lets you sort of algorithmically, according to different, like a sort of a Markov chain concept. Basically, it's like a sequencer where instead of the steps being equal or being deterministic, the steps are weighted in a different way. And those little icons that are being clicked correspond to different patterns it was with drum sounds. So that sort of made sense to me graphically as a drummer, like those different shapes represent little like rhythmic cells. And then depending on the weights that are put into those number boxes, that affects the order and the proportion of how many times different cells repeat and stuff like that. So I just wanted to show that video. Unfortunately, I do not have the session with the audio for that because it's from 10 years ago and I could not find it on any of my archive hard drives or anything. But yeah, I'm equally sad actually. But I just wanted to show that because it's a perfect example, I think, of like something you might want to do with Max. Because I think like when you're talking about doing anything in Max or Super Collider, it is an investment of time. It's not the most user-friendly thing. It's not like, you open up Logic and all the tracks and everything you need is right there. And like, you just dig through the menu and eventually you find what you need. It's like, no, it's not all right there. And there's a lot of tinkering and bug fixing. And I love doing that though. And I'm not saying that to discourage anyone, but I think if you want to get into something like Max or Super Collider, the best reason is to achieve something that you sort of can't do easily within a typical DAW environment. So like if you want to make cool reverb sounds, or if you want to have a bunch of tracks that have a sort of like swirly panning weird thing like that, you could pretty easily do that in a DAW. Like I don't know that taking the time to make a whole environment in Max or Super Collider would be a good investment of time just to achieve something like that. So yeah, happy to talk more about that with people. And I wanted to open up a little project here. This is not my Max. I still have just Max for Live right now. I don't have the, it's still Max MSP, but that's why I'm opening it this way. I wanted to show you guys the inside of a plugin that someone wrote in Max, and we can just talk through a little bit of how that works and just get people's feet wet a little bit. So this is a really bizarre plugin that's called like Squid, I think. And there's like a picture of a squid and this one little percentage slider that controls the amount of the effect, which is kind of weird. And I'm gonna just turn this on. Check. Can you guys hear that? You hear how it's kind of weirdly distorted? So
I can't hear anything.
You can't hear anything? Okay. The degree of squid. Oh, sorry. My computer's muted. So do you guys hear that? It just says, that's all it does. So I'm gonna stop doing that now. But if we open this up, you can see inside. Hang on. mute this. Okay, so this is the so-called presentation view, where you just see what you see within the environment, like the user controls. But if we unfreeze it down here and then open it up into so-called patching mode, now we see what's going on. And this may not make a lot of sense, but just to quickly talk it through, this part up here is where the audio comes in, and this part out here is where the audio leaves. So everything in between this and this is what is producing the sound. As far as I can see, this is just something that someone put in to be squid-y, and it doesn't affect the sound at all. So these here that branch off, these sort of virtual cables, you can see are going into some boxes, and each of these is basically a filter. All this is doing is some kind of crazy filter stuff, and there aren't really very many controls at all. The filters here all have fixed parameters, and the only user control is this dry wet percentage slider. And if you're wondering, like, how do I know what does what, or I see all these things, what plugs in where? So with especially the newer versions of Macs now, they're pretty good about the documentation and little hovering windows and stuff. So if you mouse over anything, it'll tell you what something is. So that little inlet, as they call it, is the input. This one is for a cutoff frequency, and this one is for a resonance value. And you can see they've actually been like hard coded into the object. These are all called objects. But like if I didn't want to do that, I could just remake this as that. And now it doesn't have any preset values, but obviously it still has these little inputs. And if you create your own either a slider or a number box or whatever it might be, you can now enter in those values and change it dynamically. So again, there's really not time to go into too much stuff with Macs, but just to make everyone somewhat aware of like what's going on here and what's involved. Like if I create a couple of these number boxes like this, these output floating point values, I connect them like this, and now I can put in the values that I want. So I could, drag it up and down with the mouse, or I could type in a specific value, and that's a way of controlling what's happening. So in this case, it would be controlling like some filter activity, but there's so many different things you can do with this. It's really, the sky's the limit, like what does what, or to what, or anything like that. You can move stuff around like this, and obviously there's some, you're probably already aware or quickly seeing that there are some serious issues here keeping things organized and logical when you have one of these that's getting bigger. So one thing that you can do is encapsulate chunks of these into their own little bubbles that just have like an input and an output, and then you expand them, and within that there's all your stuff. But the basic way of working here, which again, there's great tutorials. I'm happy to go through stuff when we have more time, with people, but you just start, double click to make one, and depending what you type in here, it'll try to autocomplete. You could put in a comb filter, you could put in like a reverberation, this is a reverberation object. So there's an input where the sound goes in, there's an output where the sound comes out, and then there's a reverberation time. So this only has one parameter. And like if I inserted that here, I could, delete this little cable and create a new one that goes to the reverb's input and replace the one that was there before. So now the reverb is kind of in line where it was not before. And now if I create another little number box, I can put in a value in, let's see what it says, in milliseconds for the reverb time. If I didn't want to do it with numbers, there's other ways to do it. You can put in a slider. So that's an object. You can easily understand why people would want that. you can change, the size, the length, all that type of stuff. It's very sort of plastic, and like I could, delete this and say, you know what, I want a slider instead. Or you could say, you know what, I like seeing what the value is because the slider doesn't give me the value. So I'm going to keep the number box there. And now the slider is just sort of feeding through the number box, and I can see what the value is at any time. So it's pretty intuitive. It's sort of like Legos, and you have these little, blocks that do different things, and you're connecting them, and the sound, flows through them, sort of top to bottom is the convention typically for how these are organized. But yeah, it's pretty straightforward and to do simple stuff, and then it gets a lot more complicated to do complex stuff. So I wanted to just quickly show an example of that. This is another thing I did not make, which is a sequencer that someone made, which is a pretty cool sequencer. The way this works, you have these sliders that control these step values, but instead of just having the steps be linear like this, you can change these little buttons here. And then like if I click that one, now it's a ramp. Or if I click this one, now it's sort of 2 ramps. So you can create these sequencers where instead of just like on-offs or different levels, you have like these crazy ramping things. And then this little window here gives you a preview of the waveform that you're generating, which is, it's not like an audio waveform. You can see the pace that it's tracking through, but this would be like something for, like automating a filter or for doing something like that. Yeah, Tabe, so good. That's a really good question. If you try to connect stuff that's sort of wrong, it won't, you can't put like an audio cable into a number box. It won't let you do that. But there's nothing to stop you from putting like the output of your reverb back into the input of your patch. And then you could like blow up like with a crazy feedback explosion and stuff like that. So there's limited security, but you definitely will probably hurt your ears in the beginning, and it can be a little bit of an adventure to troubleshoot stuff as it gets more complicated. But just to give everyone a really quick look inside of this thing. So this is very neat, you can see, and you might think, I don't get it, like this is obviously pretty complex, but there's not a lot going on here. And the reason is that like this, for example, is one of those sub patches. So you can open it up, and within this box is all of this stuff, but it was encapsulated to make it more compact. So that's a pretty cool thing you can do in Max. And this whole thing itself is also a pretty complex thing under the hood that the creator just chose to streamline in this nice way. And yeah, I think that's about it that I wanted to just briefly cover for the sake of time, but I hope that gives everyone kind of a taste. And as I said, I'm happy to go in more detail and troubleshoot stuff and help people get started. There's good tutorials. Then as a counterpoint to that, I wanted to show some stuff in Super Collider. I think Super Collider is ideal if you have, I guess I would say if you don't feel too afraid of just like raw code per se, and like a more of a traditional coding environment. But it's extremely powerful. There's really cool things you can do. So this is a project of mine from quite a while ago. And as you can see, this is basically like a coding environment. So you wouldn't necessarily have any reason to think this was gonna like produce music unless you knew what was going on. The advantage to Super Collider over Max is that because it's not a graphical interface like this, there are a lot of things you can do that are really flexible. Like for example, let's say in Max, you want to have a really rich, filter effect where you have like 50 different filters that are like notch filters, all at different frequencies, and they're all like moving around, and like at the same time and mixing together. You could certainly do that, but you'd have a lot of these blocks, a lot of these virtual cables. It would take a lot of sort of troubleshooting to get that all right. In Super Collider, you could make like one of those filters and create a certain, like randomization or whatever you want so that they're not all the same, and then make 50 of them. Like just change a 1 to a 50. So, and all of the connections are done logically with code, but they're not made with like making all of these virtual wires. So depending on the kind of stuff you want to do, SuperCollider could actually be much better. So I would say that from my experience, if you want something that has a good user interface, if you want to have something that's pretty simple but does something cool, Max is definitely probably easier and nicer. If you don't care so much about an interface, but like maybe you want to have something where like you turn it on, like you press go and you know what's going to happen and it's doing some interesting thing that's just like algorithmically shifting all the time and it like never repeats and it's always kind of transforming and being a little bit different. That kind of thing you can do much better in SuperCollider in many ways. There's a lot of really cool things you can do. Like actually, if we look in here, we don't really have time to go through all of this, but you can see these right here. So each line here that begins with that LF noise. So those are like low frequency oscillators that are controlling values from these resonant filters. And it's really easy with just a line of code to have some sort of, you can use like Brownian noise, like anything you can think of, all of these different statistical things to affect parameters in a really, really cool way that doesn't take that much effort or that much code. Once you learn how it works, it's relatively easy because you don't have to reconnect all your cables. You just cut and paste. I'm going to pop out this and paste in a new line of code, and it'll sound really different. So that can be a really fun way of working. It does integrate with C. I mean, it's coded in C. So I don't. My coding skills are not good enough for that, but you can certainly create your own UGens, as they're called. And here, just to quickly demonstrate something, I'll make a little space here. So the equivalent to those blocks in Max in SuperCollider are what are called UGens, and they all have the blue text. So like if I wanted to make a new one which records sound into a buffer, there's a UGen called record buff, and you can see as I start typing it, it will prompt me, and you can then the AR means audio rate, a KR means control rate. It would make no sense to have a buffer at control rate. And then inside of parentheses, you have various parameters, arguments as they're called. And that's very similar to the inlets in the Max blocks. You have your different parameters that you can set for each thing. And in both of these platforms, there is pretty good documentation. So, if I don't know what something is, I can look it up here and read about it, and it will tell me all this stuff, because you really can't just kind of mess around with this too much without knowing sort of what you're trying to do. So there is definitely a learning curve, and but there are really, really good tutorials and text documentation out there. So I definitely recommend looking at it. That's one. This is one that I made a while ago that I wanted to try to play something, if I can get this working. Oh, one other thing to note it's kind of nerdy but potentially interesting. The way that SuperCollider works, there's a sound server that's running, and there's another counterpart, which is the sort of the language piece. The language piece tells the sound server what to produce. So in theory, if you were doing an installation, or if you are very technically minded and want to explore SuperCollider in the future, you can do really cool things like having multiple servers running on different computers, all receiving, like score or information of one kind or another. It's almost like computers on a LAN. They will be able to intercommunicate that way, which is pretty cool. So this is something I made quite a while ago, hoping this will work. Just give me one sec. Okay. So let's see. This should do something cool. In just a sec. Hopefully. Check. Check. I may have forgotten to do this. That's fine. So as you can see, I have these blocks, and they're being loaded at discontinuous. So this is very different from Max. Sorry, I'm talking a little bit because I have my voice in both ears. Check, check, check. Check, 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 check. So I hope you guys can hear that. Yep.
Is it like an echo effect?
So it is sort of an echo effect. Ah, God, this is so weird. I'm sorry. There, that should be different. Yeah. So it is kind of an echo effect. The way it works is the sound comes in to a buffer, and then the buffer plays the sound backwards, and it plays it backwards into a reverb, and that feeds a second buffer. The second buffer plays that backwards. So basically, with a short delay of however many seconds the reverb is, your input comes back to you with reverse reverb. So like if you go like pa, then what you hear back is like with reverb. So it was yeah, flip exactly. Yeah, thanks, Laura. That's the technical term. Yeah, so that was for a piece that I was sort of asked to produce that kind of effect, and it's pretty flexible to do that in Super Collider. I mean, there's a lot of code here to just try to make a few things a little nicer, but and I'll actually, a lot of this code, all of this is for the user interface. The user interface kind of sucks in Super Collider. I don't recommend it for that. I mean, I didn't try very hard on this, but even so, but this is pretty much what's creating what you're hearing. And yeah, it could certainly be done in Max, but there's a lot of reasons why it's kind of cool to do this in Super Collider. And this is only one instance of it running, but what I ended up doing a lot would be like I would run multiple instances of this at different transpositions, and like one that plays back the buffer at 20% speed and is really low and really slow and long, things like that. Once you've coded that block that does that thing, it's pretty easy to load like 3 or 4 instances of it that just have different key parameters, stuff like that. So yeah, I think that may be pretty much all I have time for with Super Collider for right now. I'm kind of sad though. Does anyone have questions about any of that stuff so far?
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, you go first. You go first.
Okay. For both Max and Super Collider, I'm just curious if there are any particular tutorials or anything like that, or any particular guides.
So I'm actually embarrassed to say that when I started learning Max, it was a much older version. It was like Max 5 had just come out. So I don't actually know for the current version like what the best tutorials may be. I think Cycling 74, who make Max, have really improved their website compared to how it used to be, and with documentation and stuff. But for Super Collider, by far the best that I've seen is this guy who teaches computer music named Eli Fieldsteel. And he has a series that's on YouTube. I linked to it in the Slack. There's, I think, about a dozen episodes. He starts from the bare minimum, and it's really good. Like, the pace is a little bit fast. It's not fast, but like, he covers everything. It's super comprehensive, but it's like you do one thing once, and it's like, okay, great, now ready for the next thing. So I think you should definitely program something along with it so it'll really sink in, because it's not like let's spend an hour talking about the basics. It's like let's go from 0 to 20 in 1 hour, and then 20 to 40 in the next hour, and then but it's really, really well done.
Is he the composer who wrote like that piece for flute and Super Collider and one for trombone and Super Collider?
I think so. He does a lot of stuff for acoustic instruments plus Super Collider. Yeah, those are great tutorials.
Cool.
Yeah. And for Max, another thing that's really good is there's so much free stuff out there that's written in Max. There's no reason why you can't download other people's stuff and just open it up.
Fuck with it.
Yeah. And especially like if you're trying to make something that does a certain effect and you find something that someone else has made and use it as a jumping off point, even if you don't know exactly what all the little boxes do, you'll learn that way. And I did that a ton. That's really helpful. With Super Collider, that's a little less helpful just because it's pretty unforgiving since it's code. Like as you start to mess stuff around, it's not like, oh, whoops, you tried to plug the thing into something that won't accept it. It's like Super Collider is just like, like you put a period somewhere it's not supposed to be. Like go find where it is and fix it. And you're like, I don't know. And then it won't work. So, but the reward is worth it.
I was curious what kind of like video playback or image stuff Super Collider can do.
As far as I know, not really any. I mean, maybe a little bit, but it's pretty much an audio platform.
Okay,
It does have like a very primitive sort of canvas window drawing functionality to make interfaces. And I suppose if you were really creative, you could make something visual with that by kind of hacking the interface functionality. But something that's really cool that I was thinking of talking about another time at ZFest maybe, I got into a long time ago. I'm pretty rusty, but processing is a really cool environment for creating programmed visuals. Some of you may have heard of it or tried it. And one of the great things, again, with Super Collider is because it's code, and it's basically similar to JavaScript, as you could see if you know any Java stuff. It's a pretty comfortable syntax. It's very similar to the processing syntax in many ways. So you can get Super Collider to talk to something like processing pretty easily using, like OSC, for example, and that's really cool. So I would almost recommend something like that if you like the idea of doing like a visualization video component. It is two separate platforms, but it would probably be a lot more polished.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
But of course, there's Jitter in Max if you want to do. I mean, that's its own thing. Yeah.
Oh man, I've been messing with this one application in Jitter for several months, and it works, but it's just such a pain in the ass to use.
Yeah, I tried it, and I honestly kind of lost interest. Just for some reason, it didn't click with me. But I did really like processing. So if you're curious, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's free. And it's really cool.
Cool.
Yeah. Any other questions?
I have a question. When you're looking at doing a project, how do you decide whether to do it in one of these, which one of these, or whether to do it in a DAW?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it really depends on the fundamental level. Like you could theoretically do almost anything in almost any of them. So at a fundamental level, like what is the sort of aesthetic you're seeking? What is what problem are you trying to solve with a computer, basically? And if the problem is layering a bunch of tracks and balancing them and adding some effects, I think there's basically no argument for using Max or Super Collider for that. A DAW is made for that. If you don't really care about recording stuff or doing like traditional, post-processing, but you just want to have like a sound world, I think Max and Super Collider in different ways are great for that. So you could almost create like a sort of palette of different signal processing little modules. They could all be interconnected, whether it's Super Collider or Max. You could have a sort of palette of different things that you control with sliders proportionally, or you have them sequentially as part of a piece. Like I'm going to have all the dense textural granular synthesis stuff, and then there's going to be like the more sedate reverby textured part or whatever. Like you could, if you want that kind of flexible world, I guess, where you're putting in some kind of input, see Peter, putting in some kind of input, and then stuff is happening indefinitely. Something like Max or Super Collider is really great. And there are ways to do scheduled things and scores and timed things, but just for my personal taste, I think it's a lot easier to do that in a proper timeline, like something that has a timeline. If you want to orchestrate events in time, just use a timeline, and for more like for sculpting sound and doing something that's algorithmic, doing something that's like non-linear in some way, that's where I think something like Super Collider really, or Max really shines. And live input, live processing of acoustic stuff. Yeah, definitely.
So I assume you can do all kinds of sort of, function composition in here where, like, if I wrote some kind of script that took input and generated a series of numbers, I could then use that as the input for something that could take a fixed parameter could instead take a function of some kind.
Yeah, there's all kinds of stuff you can do like that. And I know there's objects in Max that sort of allow you to do that. I will say in Super Collider, that's really kind of its forte. There's actually a whole bunch of pattern objects that are specifically designed to do things like that. So, you can define an array of values, like I want to scale, here are my values. And, maybe it's just intonation, so they're written as fractions, or maybe they're, decimals that represent some microtonal thing. Whatever it is, like you define this array, and then now that you have it, I want to do like every permutation of it, or I want to do like groups of 3 in every possible combination, or like anything like that you can imagine. Super Collider is amazing for that. So you could do something like that in Max, but particularly if you have an interest in sort of pattern-based work, I think Super Collider is really worth exploring. And keep in mind too, you don't have to generate the sounds in Super Collider. You could, it takes a little more work to interface it, but you could always use it, via OSC or I think even MIDI. That might be possible to, to trigger something else. So just wanted to point that out.
Okay, I've been wanting to get into just intonation, and that had not really clicked in my head.
Yeah,
so that's
I can
amazing.
show you guys super quick on here. So hold on one sec. Yeah, I don't think we're gonna mix and match, but that's okay. We can do that another time. Oh, this is so disorienting. Sorry. Okay. So you guys see that? So this is something I made. Well, gotta load the code correctly. Important detail. Okay. So all this stuff here creates, when you put in a value here that represents a value in hertz, so let's do like 300 hertz, it generates this. Oh no, it's that zoom. Hold on one sec. When the pop-ups don't show. Here. Okay, that's what you should see. So these are not arbitrary. They're from the palette of values that are that were in green that you may have seen in the earlier window. And when I click that 300, now you can see all these ratios that are obviously in just intonation have been calculated to correspond to the appropriate value in hertz, taking the 1/1 as the center point. So it's sort of a symmetrical scale where there's equally many below and above 1/1. And so if I, let me just unmute, share original sound. So hopefully you can hear this. You guys hear that? Yeah. Not
I
very
don't
much.
think a share original sound worked. I think we're hearing it through your speakers.
Oh, okay. Just a sec. No, it says it's on. I'm gonna mute. That was kind of cool too, but not what I was trying to show. Let me try that one more time. That's what it is. Anyway, that's pretty obvious what that does. But it's kind of fun to just play around. So it's just a quick thing I made to familiarize my ear with different intervals in just intonation as a kind of reference. So like stuff like that is really easy to do in Super Collider, or Max, you could do it. And if you think about it, that would be really hard to do in a DAW, because like how do you tell a MIDI instrument or something to play back like some sort of fractional value? And it's really not that hard. It's like a bunch of fractions and you multiply them by some reference value in hertz and then get little like sawtooth wave synths or whatever to like play those different values. So to do those kind of things, it's definitely Super Collider or Max is really fun, and you can create really good stuff that way. Any other?
If you got
Last
time, I
question.
actually had another question about like, I've seen before you can do some kind of smartphone integration in order to be able to control it in a more tactile way.
With Super Collider?
I think it was with Pure Data.
Pure Data?
Yeah.
Oh, I've actually seen people that coded stuff that runs on a phone.
Ah, there is like a PD for iPhone, I think.
For iPhone?
Like, I haven't looked into it, but
That's
looks
awesome.
cool.
That would be a good reason to get an iPhone. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, phone integration is cool. There's also a lot of maybe not a lot, but I remember getting something on an old phone I had that was it could do OSC messaging, so it was like a touch screen interface, and I basically, it was some free app that lets you make like sort of generic sliders or buttons or whatever, but they send out OSC messages, and so then you could use a phone as a controller. Yeah,
I could never get those things to work. I was trying so hard last year, but it just didn't like something about my system.
It can be really frustrating, yeah, to do things like that. There's definitely a certain patience factor that is required. Yeah. I'm sorry we didn't have time for mixing and mastering. That was obviously too ambitious of me to think that we could do all three, but I actually kind of saved that deliberately just because I think that in particular would be worth doing like an entire session on. And what I was thinking of doing was I'll just take something that I've recorded in the last few months and just open it up like from scratch with like no changes to anything, and we could just do like a collective walkthrough, at a nice slow pace, like how to make it, reasonably polished. But that would take a little bit of time. But I'm happy to do that if people are interested. That's probably the best way to do mixing, mastering, and then I can do it on one computer and not have all this weird stuff. So that would be good too. Cool. Thanks for bearing with me with all that. I hope it wasn't too like disorienting to have so many different things in one go. But please do get in touch. My email's in the chat or on Slack. If you have any questions about your projects, or if you want to find a time to meet and talk about anything, I'm not very good at keeping things super concise, and I would be very happy to instead like just give whatever people are working on the time it deserves. So yes.
Cool. Thanks
Thank you
so much. If there are more questions, like Luke said, feel free to send them to him or to us or whatever. We'll get them to him. And we have next week Honestly, I'm not going to know out of the top of my head, but it's earlier in the day on either Thursday or Friday. I think Friday at 2, I think. So hopefully we can maybe I know we might not get
I think it's Thursday, actually.
Great. Thank you.